BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game. The currency standard. And if that happens, that's like losing a world war. We'll be a second-tier country. We'll literally be a second-tier country if that happens. Now, you're losing Brazil. You're losing Colombia, South America. You're losing Iran. You've lost it. You've lost Russia. And if you haven't lost them yet, you're going to lose them. China's on the yuan, so China's gone.
For decades, Washington thought it had Africa all figured out, a continent rich in resources, full of potential, but always dependent on Western loans, dependent on Western aid, dependent on Western approval. But that script, the one written in Washington's boardrooms and enforced by its diplomats, is being rewritten, line by line, deal by deal, country by country. And this time, Africa isn't waiting for permission. Something historic is happening quietly across the continent. It's not on the front pages of American newspapers, it's not trending in Washington's press rooms, but make no mistake, the United States can feel it. A seismic shift is underway and it's worth over $200 billion. That's right, Africa is turning its back on the dollar and moving deeper into the BRICS alliance. The message is clear, the age of American dominance in Africa is ending. Let's be honest, for over half a century, America's influence in Africa wasn't just about partnership. It was about control through aid, through currency, and through pressure. When Africa borrowed from the IMF, Washington smiled. When African nations traded in dollars, Washington cheered. And when leaders followed U.S. policy lines, Washington rewarded them with more development assistance. But now, the game has changed. Over the past 2 years, African leaders have started asking one question, a question that shakes Washington's entire strategy. Why should we keep using the dollar when we can trade in our own currencies or with our BRICS partners? That's the question that keeps U.S. officials awake at night, because if Africa stops trading in dollars, America loses leverage, and if it loses leverage, it loses control. The panic started in quiet whispers. First, it was South Africa deepening ties with China and Russia. Then it was Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria exploring oil and mineral contracts in yuan and rupees. Now, nearly every major African economy from Kenya to Ghana is exploring ways to ditch the dollar in regional trade. $200 billion in transactions gone from America's reach, and the world's most powerful nation is suddenly realizing Africa isn't the aid continent anymore. It's the next global power battleground. Washington has seen this movie before and it never ends well for them. In Asia, China rose while the US debated. In the Middle East, Russia gained ground while Washington issued warnings. And now, in Africa, the world's fastest growing region, the same pattern is unfolding. But this time, America isn't facing just one rival, it's facing a coalition, BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and soon more African nations joining the list. This isn't just an economic bloc anymore, it's a statement of independence, a declaration that global trade no longer needs the dollar as its heartbeat, and Washington knows it. That's why U.S. envoys have been flooding African capitals. Recently, they ray not there for photo ops or charity missions, they ray there to negotiate survival. Because every new BRICS-backed project, every oil deal signed in yuan, every railway funded by Indian investment, it all chips away at one thing, America's global dominance. But let's pause for a moment and ask, why is Africa making this move now? Why risk upsetting the world's biggest economy? Why turn toward BRICS and away from the West? The answer is simple, Africa has finally learned from history. For years, African nations have borrowed billions from Western banks, only to be trapped in debt cycles. They've watched their raw materials exported cheaply while finished goods return expensively. They've seen their currencies collapse after every shift in U.S. interest rates, and they've realized that true independence doesn't come from flags or speeches, it comes from financial freedom. So when BRICS offered an alternative, loans without lectures, trade without the dollar, infrastructure without conditionalities, Africa listened. And this time Africa said yes, $200 billion worth of trade and investment redirected, new currency systems developed, new banking networks emerging, new alliances forming, and Washington panicking, because the BRICS system represents everything America fears. A world where the dollar isn't the only option, a world where African nations decide their own destiny. In 2023, when Kenya's president boldly said we must move away from the US dollar dependency, Washington dismissed it as talk. But when Nigeria followed with its own BRICS-aligned oil deals, when Egypt joined BRICS, officially when Ethiopia signed infrastructure partnerships worth billions with China and India, the tone changed. Suddenly, Washington wasn't laughing, it was calculating, strategizing, panicking. And there's a reason this panic runs deeper than headlines, because beneath this 200 billion shift lies something even bigger: the possibility of a new global order. If Africa, with its population of 1.4 billion people, its mineral wealth, and its growing influence aligns with BRICS, then America's monopoly over trade, finance, and diplomacy could crumble within a decade. That's why Washington is scrambling to renew its presence in Africa. That's why U.S. delegations are racing to compete with China's Belt and Road. That's why Western media suddenly has a new obsession with African democracy every time an African leader signs a deal with Beijing, Moscow, or New Delhi. It's not about democracy, it's about dominance. But here's what Washington didn't expect. Africa isn't choosing sides, it's choosing itself. This isn't about replacing America with China, it's about ending dependency permanently. It's about African nations deciding for the first time in modern history that they won. To be told what currency to use, what ally to trust, or what path to follow. The $200 billion shift to BRICS is more than just numbers. It's symbolism. It's the sound of a continent reclaiming its seat at the global table. And while Washington scrambles to protect its interests, Africa is quietly building something far more powerful: a future where its resources, its markets, and its voice can't be dictated from abroad. So when you hear Washington's analysts warning of risks, or when Western media claims Africa is making a mistake, remember this: they're not warning Africa, they're warning themselves, because the US doesn't fear losing friends, it fears losing control. And for the first time, Africa isn't asking for it back, it's simply walking away. This is the story Washington doesn't want to talk about. This is the shift that could redefine global power forever. This is why Washington is panicking about Africa's $200 billion move to BRICS. They call it the Great Realignment, a quiet revolution not fought with soldiers or slogans, but with contracts, currencies, and connections. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began with a simple question whispered in African ministries and presidential offices: why should our future depend on someone else's dollar? That question, dangerous to Washington, liberating to Africa, became the spark that lit an economic fire. In 2023, the BRICS summit in Johannesburg sent shockwaves through the global system. Leaders from across the global south gathered not just to discuss trade but to redesign the architecture of global power. Among them were nations that the US had long considered allies. But these so-called allies were quietly drawing a new map, one that didn't revolve around Washington. $200 billion, that's the estimated value of Africa's trade and investment commitments now moving under BRICS-linked frameworks: energy, infrastructure, mining, and digital finance. South Africa, already a BRICS member, became the bridge. Ethiopia joined soon after, Egypt followed. Nigeria began exploratory talks, and behind closed doors, countries like Kenya, Algeria, and Ghana are considering what used to be unthinkable: settling trade in local currencies or in BRICS digital tokens, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Washington's officials call it a threat, but for Africa, it feels like freedom. Because every time the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, African economies feel the pain. Currencies crash, debt skyrockets, imports get costlier, and while Washington blames global market conditions, African citizens pay the real price. That's why this shift isn't just economic, it's emotional, it's personal. Take Nigeria, for example. Africa's largest economy, long tied to the dollar, is now signing crude oil export deals with India in rupees. It's a small detail with massive implications. The moment a nation can trade oil, the world's most powerful commodity, without the dollar, the US loses a piece of its global throne. In Kenya, President William Ruto made headlines when he urged African nations to move away from dollar dependency altogether. He wasn't just talking economics, he was speaking sovereignty. And when he said, "Why should we pay in a currency that we don't control?" the world listened. Then came Egypt, strategically positioned between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Cairo saw opportunity. BRICS offered infrastructure loans without political lectures, and Egypt accepted. Now its Suez expansion projects and energy corridors are being powered by funds from Beijing and New Delhi, not Washington or the IMF. Meanwhile, Ethiopia, recovering from conflict and economic strain, surprised everyone by joining BRICS directly. It was a symbolic victory not just for Addis Ababa but for an entire continent, because Ethiopia isn't just joining a bloc, it's joining a movement that says Africa no longer needs to beg for a seat at the table, it can build its own table. And that's exactly what BRICS is offering: infrastructure deals that don't come with IMF strings attached, technology partnerships that transfer knowledge, not just profit, banking reforms that give Africa control over its own reserves. It's a new model of power, one that Washington neither built nor controls. In response, the US has launched what it calls renewed partnerships with Africa: high-level visits, economic summits, billions pledged in aid and investment. But for many African leaders, it feels like The same promises, the same language, the same conditions. Only this time, there's an alternative, and that's what's keeping Washington up at night. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa has options. Think about it. When Ghana needs financing for a railway, it no longer has to fly to Washington. It can pick up the phone to Shanghai or New Delhi. When South Africa wants to build a green energy corridor, it can partner with Brazil or Russia through BRICS frameworks. When Nigeria needs new refineries, India steps in with engineers and capital. Every one of these deals, everyone chips away at the dollar's dominance. Now, here's the twist most people don't see. This isn't just about economics, it's about control over narratives. For decades, Africa was told what to believe about itself, that it was developing, corrupt, unstable, that it needed guidance. But BRICS flipped that script by giving African nations agency, not pity, partnership, not paternalism. And Washington, which once dictated the headlines, is suddenly struggling to stay relevant in the story it used to control. Yet, behind the closed doors of power in DC, one truth echoes louder than any press statement. If Africa continues this path, if BRICS expands, if local currencies take hold, the global financial order could shift permanently. The petrodollar system, the backbone of American dominance, would weaken, and that's not a distant theory anymore. It's already happening, because every deal signed in yuan, ruble, or rupee is more than a contract. It's a vote, a quiet vote against the system the US built, and as those votes multiply, Washington's voice grows smaller. So now the question isn't whether Africa can change the game. The question is, can Washington adapt before it's too late? Because the old rules no longer apply, the old deals no longer hold, and the old assumptions that Africa would always need the West no longer make sense. This isn't a story of confrontation, it's a story of correction. A correction long overdue. For centuries, Africa was seen as a prize. Now it's becoming a player. And as BRICS continues to grow, Washington faces a reality it's been avoiding. The future of global power might not be decided in Washington, London, or Brussels anymore, but in Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Lagos, and Pretoria. This is how the balance begins to tilt. This is how a continent reclaims its story. And this is how a $200 billion shift is rewriting the world. In the end, this story isn't just about money, it's about meaning. It's about a continent finally realizing the value of its voice and daring to use it. Washington's panic isn't about the $200 billion shift itself. It's about what that shift represents, a world that no longer waits for America's approval. For generations, the US played the role of global referee, deciding which nations got loans, which leaders got praised, which currencies defined global trade. But the rise of BRICS and Africa's growing confidence has redrawn that map, and for the first time in decades, the lines aren't being drawn in Washington. The truth is, Washington isn't just fighting a financial battle. It's fighting for relevance. That's why you've seen a sudden flood of US delegations to Africa, a scramble of strategic partnerships, new aid promises, new investment funds, even Western media headlines suddenly rediscovering African stories. But behind the smiles and speeches, there's anxiety, a quiet realization that the old playbook no longer works. Because Africa has changed, and this time it's not asking for validation. African leaders have seen how the global system shifts when one currency controls all. They've seen the fragility of a dollar-based order, how one interest rate in Washington can decide the fate of millions in Accra, Nairobi, or Lusaka. They've watched the IMF's rescue packages tighten the same noose they were meant to loosen, and they've decided never again. So what happens next? Washington is deploying a twofold strategy. On one hand, charm, diplomatic tours, investment summits, billion-dollar pledges, the message, we're back in Africa, but on the other, containment. Media campaigns questioning BRICS motives, analysts warning of debt traps, think tanks publishing reports that sound suspiciously familiar, China's control, Russia's influence, India's ambition, all designed to paint BRICS as a danger and Africa's independence as a mistake. Yet, beneath the propaganda, Africa's progress continues. The new BRICS payment system, still in early stages, could allow African nations to settle trade in local currencies or through a unified digital token. The BRICS New Development Bank, now with African members, is offering loans without the old conditions: no structural reforms, no privatization demands. And African economies, once fragile, are now experimenting with a kind of financial courage never seen before. It's no longer just about aid, it's about architecture, building a financial system designed by the Global South, for the Global South. But every transformation comes with resistance, and as the balance of power tilts, Washington's influence in Africa's future will depend on one thing. Can it learn to respect partnership instead of enforcing dominance? Because what's happening now is bigger than policy. It's cultural, it's historical, it's generational. The children born today in Abuja or Addis Ababa may grow up in a world where trade doesn't begin and end with the dollar. where African nations trade with one another freely powered by digital currency, African banks, and BRICS-backed innovation, where the word aid becomes outdated replaced by exchange. And yet, amid this optimism, one truth stands tall: Africa's rise doesn't need to come at America's fall, but America's arrogance could ensure it does. Because history has shown when nations refuse to share power, they lose it, and as the new order forms, the US faces a choice: adapt to a multipolar world, or resist it and fade. Across the continent, you can feel it, from the copper mines of Zambia to the tech hubs of Kenya, from Lagos's refineries to South Africa's ports. The pulse of a new economy is beating, one that speaks a different language, not the language of dependency, but of destiny, not aid, but alliance, not fear, but freedom. And in Washington, they can hear that rhythm too. They call it risk, they call it instability, but in truth it's rebirth, a rebirth that no superpower can stop. Because the future isn't waiting in the halls of the IMF or the corridors of Capitol Hill anymore. It's being written right now in African boardrooms, marketplaces, and ministries. Africa is no longer asking who controls the dollar, it's asking who controls tomorrow, and that right there is why Washington is panicking.